We got some reading to do, right? I have not read from Ann-Margret for a little bit. I apologize. Holidays, all this other stuff that's been going on. A lot of taping of conversations and negotiations. So, where are we at? We're reading the Ann-Margret, her storybook, right? I was just watching the series on Netflix, Elvis's Women, I think it might be called, or I don't know what it's called, but all the girlfriends come and talk and all this other stuff, and David Stanley was on there saying what he was saying, and then of course he talked about what a connection he had with Elvis had with Ann-Margret, and of course Billy Stanley always talks about what an amazing connection as well, which is part of why we're reading this book. Now, apart from Elvis, Ann had a wonderful, wonderful career. She had a wonderful life, with some ups and downs, right? Like we all do. We all have ups and downs in life. But that's part of why I'm reading this. So thank you for subscribing. Share the video around. And let's get to reading, okay? So this is the 4th chapter. I was at school the day in '52 when Daddy's boss, Mr. Leonard Johnson, called Mother in a concerned, shaky voice. Gus had been hurt, he told her, badly hurt, and she was to come right away. Mother got the name of the hospital, and then she called all the relatives. The support system provided by such a close community sprang into action. Everybody helped. Auntie Gerda volunteered to go with Mother to the hospital. Auntie Mina assigned herself the task of dealing with me when I came home. But Mother wanted to tell me herself. Just then I pushed open the door and noticed her tears immediately. "It's Daddy," she said. I didn't know what to say, and I started to cry myself. "He's going to be okay," she said, reassuring herself as much as she said, reassuring herself as much as me. Then she explained the plan. I pleaded to go with her to the hospital, but she insisted it was a time for adults only. "I'll call as soon as I know something," she promised. At the hospital, she was met by Mr. Johnson, who told her that Daddy was working on a building and had slipped and fallen 2 stories on the concrete pavement, landing directly on his back. Gosh, that's 25 feet, really. Falling on his back. In retrospect, his fall was an eerie foreshadowing of my nearly fatal tumble from a similar height 20 years later. Both Daddy and I were lucky to be alive. My father shattered his pelvis in 4 places. He also affected numerous bruises, contusions, and sprains. He also suffered numerous bruises, contusions, and sprains. When Mother entered the room, he was unable to move or communicate. The doctors had him rigged to a flotation device, which took the weight and pressure off of his body. Although he would remain in that condition for a week, Daddy received a good prognosis for recovery, though a slow one, and Mother phoned home with the news, sounding as positive as could be expected. But we were all greatly relieved. Feeling as if I could let out my breath after holding it all afternoon, I thanked God. As Daddy recovered, I repeated Mother's words of wisdom. God never gives us more than we can handle. It was true, and has proved true over the years, time and time again. And I knew that I could handle a lot. Daddy's ordeal proved that all of us could. He spent several weeks in traction, and then several more in the hospital. Then he was laid up for another 5 months at home. Not only was he debilitated, he was also devastated at not being able to support his family. So, a man's pride is a pretty big thing, a deep thing. Now, in this day and age, a lot of households have 2 people working. It's not a big deal if only one is working. It does make it more difficult in this day and age. I can tell you that my wife, she wanted to start working a few years ago, and she did. But for the first 15 years of our marriage, for the most part, it was just me working. We sang together, so she did work too. She brought in money that way through her talent. But it is a lot easier on a family. But when the main income, which seems to be that he was the main income and maybe the only income, that has to be a terrible guilt-ridden thing. You know, men are supposed to be strong. You know, this is a kind of a sexist thing to say. You know, that's kind of the what's always been throughout time. Men are strong. We provide. It's not the truth always. You know, women are just as strong and they're just as able to provide and work and, you know, but that's what he was going through. He was like, what's going to happen to my family? Excuse me. If I can't work, what's going to happen, right? Though he received some disability money as well as a bonus, the financial strain was severe. To help, Mother got a job cleaning house for our neighbor, Mr. and Mrs. Alton. It was good, honest work, and it left her time to care for Daddy and me. Now, when Daddy's slow recovery made hard times even rougher, Mrs. Alton offered Mother a different, more lucrative job as a receptionist and caretaker of the Alton Nelson Funeral Home, which they co-owned in the nearby suburb of Wilmette. In exchange for Mother's services, we could live there rent and utility free. This, of course, meant for moving from Fox Lake and all their relatives, but we had very little choice. For so long, I had been taught to be resolute, to accept adversity. But this time, I had trouble meeting the family standard. It's tough. That's a tough thing. The funeral home had a tiny apartment-like space. A family room, kitchen, bathroom, and living room that doubled as a room for mourners. I slept on a fold-out sofa in the room where families waited before and after services. This little room was adjacent to the viewing room. Sometimes I had to wait until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning before I could go to bed. Good Lord, did y'all know about that? So she lives in a funeral home. I mean, most kids don't have a problem staying up late these days. This would have been, what, the 50s, I think. Early 50s, late 40s. There's nothing. You had nothing going on. The TV wasn't even on all day long, I don't think. And you're in a funeral home. Good Lord. A bit creepy, right? For most people to think about that. Those nights were so long and sad. Mother and Daddy and I would wait in the dinette area watching TV with the volume extremely soft. When the last mourners finally left, I'd go into my room and fold out the sofa. There was always smoke from cigarettes, so Mother opened the windows while I curled up under the blankets. Now, in the insecure, fragile world of childhood, the traumas of sleeping in too close proximity to a casket were nothing compared with the devastation of starting yet another school. That's another thing that makes a child shy. It does, going in and out of schools. The semester was almost over when I enrolled in the 6th grade. I didn't know a soul, said Ann-Margret. It was as if I had come from Sweden all over again. I guess that's what it is, Valsjoven. I still don't have, I mean, I know that some of y'all said how to pronounce it, but I don't have that memorized yet. But it's as if she had come from overseas all over again. And once again, I was plagued by the same anxiety and fear as before, perhaps even more. Wilmette was a wealthy suburb, and it wasn't at all what we were used to. The fathers were mostly professionals, and many of the mothers were ladies who stayed at home and looked as pressed and perfect as Donna Reed in their pretty dresses and pearl necklaces. At school, a lot of the girls wore matching cashmere sweaters and pencil skirts. They seemed to own every color cashmere sweater ever made. I'd seen so many I'd never even seen one, not even in big department stores. Mother knitted my sweaters, while the majority of my wardrobe consisted of things that my cousins outgrew. So, have y'all experienced this kind of thing, you know, where what you had was much less than what those of your classmates had or your friends? It does make you work harder, you know, to succeed, to have maybe that stuff, or have that acceptance. I bit my lip and listened to all my mother's remonstrances about the clothing not making the person and so forth. It helped some, but not as much as when my 6th grade teacher, Mrs. Hampton, discovered that I could sing. Mr. Hampton. After class, he complimented my voice and asked if I'd join the Glee Club. Not only did the Glee Club help my confidence, it also became the first outlet for my dreams of being an entertainer. Just as I felt life was stable at last, early one morning I lifted my head from the pillow and heard sobbing coming from my parents' room. I hurried in and found Mother on the bed, her face red and puffy, and she couldn't stop crying. Without asking what was wrong, I wrapped my arms around her. Daddy gave me the news. Muma died, he said softly. I looked at him for a disbelieving second, then began crying as hard as Mother. Mother departed for home immediately and spent 5 weeks there, leaving Daddy and me at home. It was devastating, a heartbreaking time for us, grieving Muma's death from afar, wanting to be with family back in Sweden, and coping without Mother. Mrs. Alton fixed me breakfast every morning, and Daddy left work early to be home when I got out of school. Well, one day I came home, and Auntie Mina met me instead. She said that Daddy had fallen again, this time from a ladder outside a dairy where he was working. It turned out that he had accidentally breathed ammonia fumes leaking from a tank. Luckily, Daddy suffered only a minor concussion and came home later that evening. Mother learned about this close call only after she came home from Sweden, but by then, Daddy had nothing more than a persistent backache. Well, she added to it by hugging him with all her might. We'd encountered some rough times since leaving Sweden. There was no question about that, but Mother somehow always insisted that there was a bright side. We were a family, she'd say. As long as we had each other, everything would be okay. All right, so moving on here. This is a tough beginning for a child, but maybe no more tough than a lot of us had it, right? I mean, some of us are fortunate and didn't have to move and for the poverty stuff, and some of us didn't lose a parent or grandparent. Some of us did. Some of us lost both. There's a lot of things that we have to fight through, the adversity in this life. After almost 5 months of convalescing, Daddy was his old self again. He returned to work full time, enabling us to move from the funeral parlor into the upper half of a duplex in Northfield, a nearby suburb smaller than Wilmette. Now, the difficult times faded in the background. For all these years, we had done without TV, but now we had a big black and white set, and every evening after dinner, we would watch our favorite shows. I discovered the Morris B. Sachs Amateur Hour, the local equivalent to the Ted Mack Amateur Hour, and loved watching the singers, dancers, ventriloquists, mimes, jugglers, baton twirlers, and comedians. I fantasized about going on the show myself, but didn't say a word about it to anybody. I didn't have the nerve, but luckily, someone else did. I wonder who that is. We're about to find out. Gus and Helen Randall were like godparents to me, and even contributed money for my dancing lessons. Daddy knew Gus from the Swedish clubs in Chicago. Helen was a pretty woman with white blonde hair and electric blue eyes. They had first seen me sing and dance some 5 years earlier at a birthday party for my auntie Gunilla, and decided from that impromptu performance that I had talent worth nurturing. One night after supper, as all of us watched the Morris B. Sachs Amateur Hour, Helen suggested that I try out for the show. She's a natural, Gus said excitedly. There was just one problem. How do I get on, I asked. While Gus investigated how and when I could audition, I eagerly rehearsed. Several weeks later, I faced the show's producers in a downtown Chicago studio that was full of hopeful performers, their parents, and their prodders. This was my big moment. I waited silently, trying to hide the fact that I was a knot of nerves and fears. Ann-Margret Olsen? I nearly jumped out of my seat before composing myself. I took a couple deep breaths and regained control. Almost magically, mystically, I became that other person, that character who cast away her shyness and stepped in front of the producers ready to perform. "Whenever you like," a producer said. I closed my eyes and focused. My heart pounded. As soon as the music started, everything was fine. I sang and moved as if I were at home or at school with friends. "Wonderful," the producer said when finished. "Wonderful." Somehow I knew I would be given a place in a show, and I was. Viewers picked the show's winner by phoning in their vote for best performance, and Mother also made sure that every Swede in the vicinity tuned into the show. I didn't give one thought about winning. I just wanted to do well and to make my parents proud. On the big night, my dress was the one I wore as a bridesmaid at my cousin Greta's wedding several months earlier. I sang "Make Love to Me," a popular song that sounded risque considering my age, though it seemed to go over well. Then Mr. Sachs announced that I'd won first place. I was deluged with prizes: a white orchid, a wristwatch, and a check for $75. As a winner, I made another appearance on the talent contest the following week. This time, though, I lost. I took it without disappointment, knowing that I tried my hardest and had done my best. It was, as my mother pointed out, part of realizing that everybody has their time in the sun. So, this is great. We're getting to see the beginnings of this. And unlike Elvis, who didn't win first prize, Ann did, some similar beginnings, right? And of course, Ann was kind of known as the female Elvis, right? It was kind of a reputation before Elvis and after Elvis. She desperately wanted to make things better, right? For herself, for her family, just like Elvis. And that's one of the reasons why we love Ann-Margret. New Trier High School in Winnetka, I guess that's how you say it, Winnetka. One of the best schools in the state, was well known for its great music and drama program. As a freshman, I was more than a little intimidated by the school, where cheerleaders were admired, performers celebrated, high grades were expected, and a good social life was very, very, very important. Prohibited by my parents from dating until I was 16, I turned my attention to fitting in as best as I could. The biggest event of each year was Lagniappe, a talent show produced, directed, choreographed, and performed by the students. I showed up for tryouts, but was so uneasy about introducing myself to the panel of juniors and seniors conducting the auditions that I practically backed into the room, hoping nobody would notice. I studied the judges and noticed Annie Fraser, a junior I'd seen on campus who was full of energy and talent. "I'd like to sing," I said, "and I also dance." "Sing? Dance?" Annie later told me that she had shuddered. "This girl has difficulty saying her name, never mind performing," she thought. She turned to the others. Someone else on the selection panel worried that I'd fall over from my nerves. They whispered among themselves, but I closed my eyes, collected myself, and let out the familiar strains of Bill Bailey. "Won't you come out, Bill Bailey?" Bring out the performer in me. Annie and the others were surprised and relieved. "Terrific," Annie said afterwards. "You're in." I wanted to continue fitting in, so by the summer of 1957, I went to a cheerleading camp in Indiana. The camp was supposed to be just a week long, but on the second day, a counselor pulled me out of practice and took me straight to the infirmary, where a doctor examined me and then quarantined me into a tiny little cabin because Ann says I had the chicken pox. I had the chicken pox too when I was younger. Y'all remember having the chicken pox? I do. I was glad it got me out of school. I didn't feel good, but I was glad I didn't have to go to school. "Oh, what am I going to do?" I cried to my mother as I dressed for the show. "You aren't sick," she said, "so you will do your best." Because my parents arrived the next day, I skipped ahead. My parents arrived the next day after and took me home, and naturally I was devastated. A week later, on the morning of my appearance on the Don McNeil Breakfast Club, a well-known talent show syndicated out of Chicago, my face was still covered by the red spots left over from the chicken pox. "What am I going to do?" I cried to Mother as I dressed for the show. "You aren't sick," she said, "so you'll do your best." I had wedged my foot in the door of the Don McNeil Breakfast Club because one of Mr. McNeil's producers, Mr. Peterson, had a son, Tom, who was a friend of mine in school, and he'd put in a good word. Once in the studio, I learned that Mr. McNeil was on vacation. However, his replacement was Ted Mack, the Ted Mack of Amateur Hour fame. The makeup and hair people delicately tried to cover the spots on my face and brush my hair so that it would hide some of the spots on my forehead. But once it was time for me to sing "Them Their Eyes," I underwent the usual transformation, the Ann-Margret shift from reticent to unrestrained. After my performance, Mr. Mack asked if I wanted to appear on his show. Did I? Sign me up right here. The Ted Mack Amateur Hour meant traveling to New York. Given our tight financial situation, I figured that Mr. Mack's offer was a wonderful compliment, but not likely. But I had the best stage parents in the world, never pushy, always supportive and loving. With help from my godparents, they came up with enough money for the trip. Mother and I were so excited, and yes, there's a lot of O's there from Ann-Margret. It was a gilded moment, our first time back to Manhattan, the city where our journey in this country had began 11 years earlier. I agonized over what to wear in the show and settled on a burgundy velvet dress with a scooped neck, which I'd borrowed from my cousin Anne. Feeling that "Them Their Eyes" was my lucky song, I selected it for the show, but I lost to a man who played Lady of Spain on a big Mexican leaf, and once again, I listened to my inner warning to take it in stride. My mother's teachings, my Swedish upbringing, had stressed humility, and I did my best to not feel disappointed, but all things considered, I did feel like a winner because I actually got through the song. One of my mentors in high school was Dr. Peterman, who headed New Trier's music department and became one of the most important figures in preparing me for the future. One of my girlfriends pushed me into his office and asked Dr. Peterman if he wanted to hear me sing. "I mean, she can really sing," she said. He shrugged. If he knew of my Ted Mack performance, he wasn't letting on. "Okay," he said with resignation, "sing." "I wish someone could accompany me on the piano," I suggested, feeling nervous and on the spot. "Forget the piano," Dr. Peterman said. "Just sing." "Yes, sir." Halfway through, "Won't you come out, Bill Bailey?" one of my staples. I could tell that Dr. Peterman was surprised. Afterwards, though, he simply said he looked forward to working with me in some of the school's productions. Once I knew Dr. Peterman better, I understood that he was already preparing me for new challenges. He knew how difficult show business was, and he didn't want to inflate my expectations with praise. Soon after, school was out for the summer, I got a job as a sales girl in the department store. Every morning I put on makeup, a special uniform, and took the L downtown. I also made a determined effort to find an agent. I got out the yellow pages and spent my lunch hours going to umpteen disheartening interviews. My voice teacher, Mildred Davis, knew how badly I wanted to perform and gave me the name of Hal Monroe, an agent who also had his own band on weekends, playing socials and clubs. Mr. Monroe seemed to like me, but more than that, he also appeared to be in dire need of a singer. Suddenly, I had a job. For the next couple of years, I would spend most weekend nights singing with Mr. Monroe and his band, traveling around Chicago and throughout Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So this is pretty cool. So she's young, she's out there traveling, spend most weekend nights singing with Mr. Monroe and his band, traveling around Chicago and throughout Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But one day that summer, Mr. Monroe phoned with an intriguing offer. He'd booked a female singer with the Danny Ferguson Band at the Muleback Hotel in Kansas City, but she had suddenly dropped out. Was I interested in the job? It pays $98 a week, not including room and board, he said. As if that was a bigger factor than having to ask my parents, being away from home, preparing for the start of my junior year, tryouts for the cheerleading squad, all sorts of things. My parents considered, knowing how very much I wanted a career in entertainment, and I was told I had to start 2 days later on a Sunday. Daddy woke me up early Saturday morning and loaded the car with luggage. Mother was going to stay with me in Kansas City. When we got there, Daddy helped Mother and me settle into our hotel, then drank several cups of coffee, and turned around and drove the 550 miles home so he could be at work on Monday. That was my dad. He was always such a trooper. That's a big, 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 big drive. 550 miles back in those days. You know? Sorry, looking at a picture of Lisa and Riley. I just put a video over there on Rarest Photos. So hopefully you see that one and this one about Lisa. Meanwhile, y'all still with me? Let me know. Meanwhile, I memorized an hour or so of new material, rehearsed with Danny Ferguson, and then performed at the hotel on Sunday night. Lacking any real stage presence then, I relied on enthusiasm and adrenaline as I stood in the center of the stage and clutched the microphone. But the engagement went better than anyone had anticipated, and we were held over an additional 2 weeks, which meant that I missed the start of school. But Mother reasoned that I was still getting an education, just not a traditional one. As Dr. Peterman promised, I progressed well in the theater department. I starred in both Manhattan Towers and Plain and Fancy. But the real performing highlight of my high school career occurred during the 1959 L'Agneppe. From my rendition of Heat Wave, which I choreographed, I slithered out from behind the glass door of a Tahitian set in a tight chartreuse dress, slid up my leg, slow danced center stage, and belted out, "She started this heat wave by letting her seat wave." I have no idea how that song goes. She started this heat wave by letting her seat wave. Moving that booty, 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 right? Ann-Margret, she's known for moving it. As soon as I began to move, there was a rustling in the audience by parents who thought my interpretation was way, way too steamy. Way too steamy. That's what some of the men said. That was way too steamy. And the ladies were like, "Oh Lord, that's way too steamy." Several other parents walked out. There was again the other Ann-Margret, a sultry siren who really had no idea of how different she was on stage. I was hurt when I heard my friend's father had walked out. "You've got to understand," my friend explained. "He really likes you and he respects you. He just got a little what?" I asked. Nervous, he said. Nervous. I suppose I was a dangerous creature in those days, with no knowledge of her effect on people. But I just continued innocently on, fixated on performing. Now, after graduating, I planned on attending Northwestern, which had accepted me earlier in the year. But I was torn between school and singing, so before leaving New Trier, I sought advice from Dr. Peterman. I asked what he thought might happen to me as a performer in the world outside high school, and braved for the worst. Dr. Peterman smiled. He looked almost surprised that I hadn't already had this conversation. "Look, kiddo," he said with a serious tone, "with your talent as a singer, dancer, and actress, plus your face, you could realize big things in Hollywood." I was stunned. This man who I'd respected had articulated my innermost dreams. "I predict the movies for you," he said. "You're kidding." "I'm not," he said. "With hard work, with the right breaks," he continued, "with a little luck, you can, as I said, do big things." I gave Dr. Peterman a hug and left his office, grinning from ear to ear. So, it's a, we know how big Ann-Margret got. And her dances and stuff that she does, all that stuff. From Viva Las Vegas and before, Bye Bye Birdie. She was a siren. And a threat to a lot of women. And made a lot of men nervous, right? Let me know what you think in the comments.